Good evening to you and welcome. So the top line here is jobs already under pressure before the announcement of the technical recession. You'll tell me now this has all been amplified.
Oh yes, but I mean if you remember that in 2008 we shed at least 1 million jobs in that recession. We now have the second recession in 2 years. So where will that take us? And there are various factors contributing to that. Coronavirus will still come and it will already been impacting on the farming industry. But there are several other factors. I've made a list of a few.
Well, let's look at those sectors that are under risk in just a moment. But interestingly, you raised the coronavirus. We're not even feeling that yet in terms of employment in South Africa. You're saying to me that that's another issue that we've got to start confronting.
Yes, of course it will affect the tourist industry.
Of course.
We've seen in Australia certain hotels losing $1 million a day. So certainly that. Exports to China, of course, farming industry, I think has already been affected by that. So certainly the coronavirus will have an added factor to that.
So push that aside, which job sectors then right now, in your opinion, are most at risk?
Well, we've seen 7 out of 10 industries shrinking and contracting during the last few months. So except for a few, some in mining, in particular platinum, they're not at risk. But in most steel, auto manufacturing, transport, we've seen losses in the building sector. So most of those are at risk. And wherever you rely on Eskom, you're potentially at risk. When you rely on water, you're potentially at risk. We've seen that in the poultry industry. Overall, 7 out of 10 is not a good and a positive. It
certainly isn't. Let's wind back the clock 12 years then, if we can. As you've mentioned, the 2008 recession taking a hefty toll on employment, globally and locally. What's the prediction then in terms of employment this time around? Is it going to get worse potentially? My
sense is it will get worse unless the 3 social partners get their act together. And that would be government, labour and business, and enter into a genuine social accord. Jeremy, all 3 parties go to that almost a plenary session as independent parties, where the one can't rely on the other, or the one hides behind the other, as we have at the moment.
It's a nice wish list, but we know that given current tensions between those 3 principal pillars, that's unlikely to happen.
Yeah. Well, then it becomes suicidal, doesn't it? Because then there's just no hope. Because how are we going to address those issues? If you look at every country where they've addressed some form of recession, they've said, let's look, for instance, at employment. Let's look at employment protection. Consider relaxing that to some extent. That's what Germany has done. And look at their unemployment rate as opposed to others where we've not seen that. So that has to happen. And I'm not saying that
fair
sacrifice
enough,
must just come
again,
from one party.
It's not fair, surely, to compare Germany to South Africa, given that we already have a chronic unemployment rate before we start mitigating against the effects of the recession.
Then we look at other African countries where we've seen the same. Where they've said, these are the risks, let's address it. Let's address it from all 3 parties. Let them come together. Let government give us assurance and infrastructure. Let unions give us undertakings in terms of flexibility. It's better to have a job freeze than no jobs. But there's no flexibility on that environment.
All right.
Then, of course, you look at employers. Let's cut what has Nedbank just done. And it's not new.
It's also frozen the salaries of top executives.
Exactly. Yeah. Many companies have done that in our country, and they must continue to do so. In Japan, for instance, I'm not saying we must compare all of those. You can't have a retrenchment and pay dividends to directors in some companies. So we must move out of our comfort.
So what you're saying, it's a big, bitter pill that everyone has to
all 3
swallow.
Parties must swallow.
Right. So we've looked at the coronavirus. We've looked at the recession. Let's talk about 4IR, the 4th Industrial Revolution. You make the point, and it's the correct point, that as a result of this, we are expecting to see an increase in productivity-enhancing roles. As a result of that, there will be a decrease in full-time formal employment. That's already happening, isn't it?
It's been happening for the last few years. You will recall, Jeremy, Clinton spoke many years ago, I think before he possibly met Monica, but he spoke about the jobless growth scenario. And that's been happening since when? So it's not new, but it's come much more to the fore lately. because of the fourth industrial.
But there seems to be a reluctance to accept the prescripts of 4IR in this country.
Yeah,
Why?
absolutely. Well, there's a reluctance to change. People want to stick to their ways. We must move outside of our safe environment and say we have to be brave. We have to be flexible. We have to consider as executives wage freezes. As executives, we're not going to retrench as far as it's possible. We're not going to take bonuses. So those are sacrifices on that side. But then the same with regard to the unions. They need to be flexible. We can't say, and I'm again repeating the example, I'd rather have a wage freeze than a job, isn't it? But we have the scenario where they've become so inflexible that that's just simply not possible.
Right, thank you.
We get into collective agreements, which we knew when we entered into it in the public sector, that it would be unaffordable. Now, how are we going to get past that?
As you say, it's one big bitter pill to swallow. Hugo Pienaar, thank you very much for joining us tonight, the Employment Service Director at the law firm Cliffy Decker Hofmeyr.